Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm John.
And I'm Ian. It doesn't quite have the same ring to it. This is a podcast where we discuss one comic book adaptation in relation to some of the comics that inspired them. John is back once again to fill in for Ian number 2, and this episode, in honour of the Falcon and the Winter Soldier coming to Disney+, we're discussing 2014's Captain America, the Winter Soldier, directed by Joe and Anthony Russo. We will also be discussing the first 14 issues of Ed Brubaker's Captain America Volume 5, which ran from 2005 to 2009. But in a battle between page versus screen, who will emerge as the Winter Soldier? Let's find out.
This week we're talking about Captain America, Winter Soldier.
We are, yes. So, do you want to start with the film or the comic book?
Let's start with the film, Ian.
Alright, great. Well, you must have seen it before. Do you remember what your first impressions were of it?
Oh goodness, that's a long time ago. So my first impressions of it was that it had a lot of running in it.
It does have a lot of running in it.
Right at that beginning, yeah. And that's where I learned that when I'm running, I can shout on your left at people and they look confused.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not just the beginning, is it? Now you mention it, there is just running throughout this film.
It's a real motif.
Yeah, I've never considered that before, how much running is involved in this film. And now I think about it, Endgame ends with a lot of characters all just running at each other. So I wonder if it's just a Russo's brother thing.
They just love running. Well, I've seen the Russo brothers' other work. They directed several episodes of Community, and I don't remember there being a lot of running there. So maybe it's a coincidence.
Maybe it's the constraints of a television budget. They just couldn't afford all that running.
Yeah, they couldn't get the insurance for the running. Like, what if someone does their ankle in it? And this is the kind of thing you have to think about when you're a producer or director.
Yeah, so you've actually thrown me with that observation. That is the boldest thing you could have opened with.
I remember other things I thought were great was I love the bit set in an Apple store where the assistant says that he's a specimen. That is amazing. And I just like the humorous touches throughout the movie, which are pretty great. And I really like the kind of underlying Hydra plot. Although it is so frustrating that no one has noticed. You're like, how have you not noticed? You've just made an aircraft carrier that can kill 1 million people a minute. Like, surely. There was an oversight committee who went, is this evil? But apparently it's just realistic.
Well, yeah, it probably is realistic, actually. I would not be surprised if America, or anywhere, to be honest, could make a platform that would kill 1 million people. They probably would,
yeah,
I think.
My wife pointed out that it's the same way that you can get to having nuclear missiles and still think you're the good guys. And I was like, that is a fair point. She is an astute lady.
She is, by the sounds of it. Maybe we should get her on the podcast.
No, never.
Yeah, it's a good developing plotline. I like it. I like the touches of humour, as you said as well. I think it's well balanced in this film between the superheroics, the spy thriller aspect of it, as people describe it, but it is out and out a superhero film. And yeah, the humour has a slightly lighter touch, perhaps. It's used more sparingly, and I think that works better.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying that Winter Soldier is the first movie where there's like a distinct difference between the first movie in that heroes sequence and the second. Iron Man and Iron Man 2 feel very similar. Thor and Thor 2 feel very similar.
Yeah, progressively worse in those instances. This is the first one as well where I think there's been a step up in quality.
Possibly, yeah. But I think that was one of my kind of huge takeaways when I went to see it was it feels like a spy movie rather than feeling like an old-timey war movie. And it was the first time I think I really appreciated how much the MCU can play with genre within the films. And then kind of films like Guardians, which came out after Winter Soldier, and then Ant-Man kind of do the same thing. But I think Winter Soldier was the first time they really showed off that aspect, what they can do with this kind of continuing storyline.
Yeah, because everything up until this point had been a fairly standard superhero fare. Even Thor, which perhaps should have been a bit more Shakespearean in its scope and a bit more fantasy, still played heavily into the sort of same superhero setup. And yeah, I agree with you. I think this is the first one. It helps that it is a slightly more down-to-earth genre to play with. You can more easily lean into that as opposed to something like Guardians, which is very out there. But yeah, they do seem from this point onwards to play with genre a bit more, even if a lot of the familiar tropes are still there. You know, a lot of character beats and story beats are still there, but the genres they're leaning into are a bit more varied.
Yeah, agreed. It's also the first movie that really advances the plot beyond Avengers.
Yes.
Because it came out after Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World. And arguably Iron Man 3 is a little bit of a different genre to Iron Man 1 and 2, but perhaps not as clearly demarcated.
Yeah.
But I think that was the other thing. You get the setup that Cap's movies are going to also be the movies that advance the main plot of the MCU. And I think the way they do that in this movie is very good. And also, I was surprised by how early we meet Falcon. I hadn't remembered that it was as early as it is in the movie.
Yeah, pretty much the first scene.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you don't find out that it's Bucky for quite a while, and you don't find out that Robert Redford is the baddie for quite a while as well.
Yeah.
And actually, those are two things I do remember coming out of the movie the first time I saw it. I had not remembered who Bucky was. So like, it's not until there's that flashback where they're in New York and I was like, oh, was he in the first one? And I went back and watched the first one. I was like, oh, it's that guy. And that now seems completely daft to me because Bucky's been such a huge part of the MCU since this movie. But at the time I was like, who is it? Is it, I mean, he's very handsome. So yeah, that was me paying attention.
You just thought it was a handsome man. That was your main takeaway from that film.
Steve Rogers has a crush. I'm there for that, you know. Like they spend the whole movie talking about his romantic relationships, and then he just finds his soulmate. If there are any Bucky Cap shippers listening, they're very happy right now.
Yes, Shucky, I think, or something.
Shucky, is that?
I can't remember. Stucky. That's it.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
I did notice that Cap just spends the entire film, I mean, just flirting with everyone. It's not even just Bucky. He meets Falcon, starts flirting with him. Yeah, Black Widow pulls up, flirts with her. You know, Agent 13, everyone. You know, Nick Fury, brilliant.
Yep. I mean, Nick Fury is always winking at him. And also, so another thing I noticed in this movie. So Robert Redford inspired casting.
Brilliant.
And after Jeff Bridges in Iron Man 1 was cast, and you think you know what you're getting from a character played by Jeff Bridges, and then the movie kind of plays with that expectation by making him into the bad guy.
Yeah, although shaved head and beard is movie speak for bad guy as soon as you see him, so...
Yeah, I mean, in Iron Man 1, I didn't work out that he was the villain until it becomes very obvious. But I think you're right that it is coded differently. But in this movie, I think Robert Redford, because he has kind of played the hero in all of these 70s spy movies, you don't expect him to be the villain. And then it turns out he is. And it's such a mind-blowing part of the movie where he shoots the maid and you're like, oh no, this man is a classic baddie.
Yeah.
Watching it again, knowing that, it's so obvious because as soon as Nick tells Pierce like to delay Project Insight, the very next thing we see is Nick's like life being endangered by the police or the fake police. But at the time, I don't remember putting two and two together.
No, and I think that's why Robert Redford is such good casting for that role. As you say, he is a quintessential Hollywood good guy. He is a handsome lead actor, you know, and you wouldn't expect him to be the villain, even though you think about the cast, and apart from the Winter Soldier, who by that point still hadn't turned up in the film, there was no other big name actors that could have been the villain. You know, he's the first one you really see who is going to fit that mold. I mean, it helps as well if you're a comic book reader. He's playing the character, obviously, Alexander Pierce, who is a character from the comic books. He's just a member of S.H.I.E.L.D., I believe. Relatively minor. He's popped up from time to time in the Secret Warriors and things like that. And so using that and using an existing character's name and just saying, hey, look, it's Samuel Jackson's friend, and making it seem like he's just going to be another one of the guys, and then reversing that. As you say, when you go back and watch it now, it's quite obvious. But at the time, you just think, that's Robert Redford. What's he doing in a Marvel movie? Great.
Yeah, it's the hallmark of a movie with a good twist, that the first time you see it, you don't see the twist coming, and the second time you see it, you appreciate how everything makes more sense now you know what the twist is.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as I was watching it knowing, and I was like, oh, this all slots together really nicely because I know what's coming. But I remember the sense of surprise that first time I watched it. So I do think it uses that kind of casting trick, which I think Marvel are quite good at. But it uses it very well.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I looked this up. He's 84 now. So he would have been late 70s when he made this film.
Yeah, he is.
He looks amazing.
He's looking good. Yeah, I mean, if I can have that much stage presence when I'm 79, I'll be happy.
I mean, if I could look like Robert Redford does now, I'd be happy, you know. At any age, quite frankly, he's a good-looking man. I thought Sam Jackson looked good in his, he's late 60s when he made this, but yeah. But that's enough of the Robert Redford crush hour. Let's move on to some other characters, shall we?
Yeah.
I mean, Falcon, you mentioned him on the offset. His role here is obviously very different from as it is in the comics, which we'll go on to later, but what do you make of Falcon as a character?
Falcon's great. I really like that they really well set up the parallels between him and Steve right at the beginning with that conversation about like the peds being too soft. And that's something I think, and it's not just Marvel, because it's something I think they also did very well in the most recent Star Wars movies, is they can do an awful lot in terms of character with very little. I think it really well establishes who Sam is. It well establishes something about Steve, which we know, but which we're not thinking about. And it really well kind of establishes a relationship between them that makes sense. And it does it in like 3-4 sentences or kind of not much screen time at all.
Yeah.
So when they go to Sam later in the movie, it doesn't feel like an out of left field decision. It's just like, oh, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And I really like that he's kind of working with VA, Veterans Affairs. I thought that was a nice touch as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It sets Falcon up in a really good light, as you say, in relatively little time, so that when they go knocking on his door and he instantly helps them, you know, without asking any questions, it's believable. You don't think, well, why is this guy endangering his life? You just think that's the kind of guy he is.
Yeah, exactly. I think in terms of like his superpower, I really like the wings. I think they're really cool, but it does, and then this is going to sound nitpicky, and it is a little bit. A character like Iron Man who's defined by their technology, the reason they can be defined by their technology is because their technology is so unique that it makes sense that they're the only one doing it. I mean, unless you've watched the Iron Man films in which everyone's got a super suit, and that's the whole point. But with Falcon, he says like, oh, he's a paradrop trooper, and you get the impression that these apparatus, these pieces of kit, are something the army just has. And so the one thing I kind of think is, why aren't there more people flying around with awesome robot wings? And I don't...
Yeah.
Like, and it's a very nitpicky point, and I don't think it spoils the movie, but like that's the one thing I'm always like, why not just get a bunch more? Like, give one to Cap.
Yeah. Black Widow sort of has a reaction to it as if it's something quite special. Oh, you're you know, whatever, the Exo Falcon suit or whatever they call it. She reacts to it quite strongly. So you get the feeling that it maybe isn't like every pilot in the Air Force or in the Army has that ability. But yeah, there's certainly more than one of them. And there should probably be more in the films. I suppose Falcon's similar to Vulture when he turns up in Spider-Man.
True. It does make me wonder if we see more of Falcon in the MCU, it does make me wonder whether we will see the movie where someone with that suit comes up and is the baddie. Because you've always got to do the movie where the baddie is the main character, but evil.
Yeah.
We saw it in Iron Man and Black Panther and Hulk.
Iron Man again.
Yeah, so, you know, I can see them going down that route perhaps in future movies.
I've looked at this before, and usually it is the earlier films that they do that in, the introduction, because they're telling an origin story and therefore need to just say, well, we need a shorthand for villain. What is it? They're basically the hero, but evil.
Yeah.
And that way you don't have to spend a lot of time setting them up. So the sequels, you can spend a bit more time on the villains. But the first one, you've really got to focus on the hero, which is something that, for instance, the Burton and Schumacher Batman films really didn't do well, is they focused a lot on the villains and the heroes really didn't get a look in.
Are you saying that the attention to Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy is not a highlight of your superhero movie watching?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
Okay. I mean, that's...
What is going on in those films? I mean, I know this is a sidetrack thing and we don't want to start another supernatural conversation, but what was going on in Batman and Robin where any executive thought, this is great, keep doing what you're doing. You've got Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's going to be top billed above George Clooney. Let's have him make various... whatever.
Did you not think that it was cool? That pun, better than any of the puns in that movie. Fun fact.
Yeah. At one point, he just shouts at someone. He goes, what killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age. Which isn't a pun. It's just a fact.
Yeah. I mean, he's just an educator, Ian. Anyway, we are massively off topic.
He is a professor, I suppose.
Yeah.
He's doctor. He's just there. He thought he was giving a university lecture.
In this movie, is there an argument that this movie is Cap's example of the bad guy is Cap but evil? Because is that what Bucky is, do you think? Moving on to Bucky from Falcon.
I don't entirely think that. I think Cap is much more than just his powers. I almost think that the first Captain America did that slightly, where they gave Red Skull, who is a character in the comic books who's not traditionally had Cap-like powers. He's just sort of been a baseline human, but a very evil one. They gave him Captain America-like powers, which caused his Red Skullness, which is something that has happened in the comics from time to time. So almost like that in the film, they gave that, again, to the first film. They said, right, well, here's Cap, but evil, and it also mutated him because he was a red skull on the inside or something. Whereas this one, it is very much carrying on, well, I suppose for you, perhaps, because you didn't remember the character from the first film, they've taken a character from the first film and given him his own backstory. He has got a separate and unique, okay, he's got super strength and all the generic superhero stuff, but he's also got a big robotic arm, that's cool, and his own backstory, which ties to the main villains of the film, which is Hydra and Alexandra Pierce.
Yes, but it does strike me that, like, he is a super soldier who relies on a kind of technological, I don't want to say gimmick, I don't think the shield's a gimmick, but, you know, a technological feature which has a star on it that represents a global superpower. I mean, in this case, Russia, rather than representing the States. And I think there are interesting, I completely see what you say. I think you're right that First Avenger does this more because of what you've said. I mean, and you've said this on previous episodes as well about the movie not having the time to invest in the villain, whereas I think this movie spends a lot of time invested in the villain for obvious reasons. But I do think in some ways the Winter Soldier is almost the kind of shadow Cap, both in terms of skill set but also in terms of what they represent, which is this kind of force for chaos coming out of the second world rather than the allied powers. So kind of like politically opposite as well as opposite in terms of power, and also offense rather than defense, which is the other key thing, the arm. And also, so the fight on the bridge, just the number of people just standing there handing him guns is just, that's service, that is. I hope he tips well.
He also just has loads of guns strapped to him, including my favourite, the tiny little gun in the middle of his back that I wouldn't be able to reach.
Just a little Uzi, just in case you need a little pick-me-up.
Yeah, he holds the giant gun and then keeps the tiny little one tucked away on the small of his back.
Yep.
Amazing. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do see what you're saying. I think all of superhero films, they tend to have this, is that they will have a similar character. But no, actually, now you mention more and more parallels between the two, and I think those are deliberate in the comic book as well. Certainly putting the star on it is a very obvious thing. But I think that Bucky has a bit more going on as an individual character than to just say he is a straight parallel or shadow of Cap. But
100%, yeah.
So, I mean, that's Bucky out the way. What about Sharon Carter? Because I do want to speak about her, because obviously in the comic books, which we'll speak about later, she is a much larger character.
I think you just mean Sharon the nurse, because we don't actually find out that she's Sharon Carter in this movie.
We don't, no. We have an oblique reference to her aunt, but other than that, nothing else, And
I remember, because I hadn't read the comics, I remember my mind being blown when it turns out that Peggy's her grandmother in Civil War. But no, I mean, Sharon's great. I think, especially because I didn't know the original story, it didn't occur to me at all that the neighbour across the way might not be what she seemed. And then you have that scene where Steve sees her in the mirror with the gun and you're like, oh God, what is happening? And then the whole way through, because you've got this motif of like, who do you trust? And it's not until the end where it becomes clear that she's on the right side, that, you know, we can trust her. But no, I really like the character. I really like the actress, and obviously I like what they do with her in subsequent movies. It's my one regret about Endgame is that they don't end up together, because I understand why they sent him back in time to live with Peggy, but I don't know. I just think it's a little bit of a shame for the relationship with Sharon, which I quite like.
I agree. Because as a fan of the comic books, I always like their relationship together. And I think actually that's one of my few criticisms of this film. I don't have many, but they've obviously inserted Black Widow into the plot line, where they could have easily used Sharon Carter in that role instead and had her be the spy counterpart who was educating and looking after Steve as things went. And as such, the character of Sharon gets sidelined massively, to the point where she's reduced to really only a couple of scenes in this film. And as you say, her presence is nice, it's good when she's on screen, but she has so little to do that it's a bit of a shame. And that's the same in the sequel, and ultimately I think that's why people really latched on to the Peggy relationship as opposed to the Sharon relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's something that the MCU has a problem with, and I understand why, but you have so many great supporting characters that don't get the time to breathe. And this is actually something that WandaVision addressed explicitly, is that you get Darcy and Randall is the name of the actor.
Jimmy Woo.
Jimmy Woo, yes. Randall Park is the actor. And I loved, especially in Ant-Man, because I love Randall Park as an actor. So when he was in Ant-Man, I was like, this is so good. He likes magic. He's such a dork. Oh, I want more of him. And then he's in WandaVision, and I'm like, brilliant. And so I do think that the MCU has this problem where you need the movies to have the core characters. So I understand why Black Widow is in the Agent 13 role, but I do think that it is a shame they didn't do more with Sharon in the movie, because I think she's really good too. And I'd like to see her crop up in the Disney Plus stuff they're doing.
Well, I presume you have watched the first episode of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
Yes, I have. I've watched the first 2.
Yes, of course, because as of recording it, it came out yesterday. So she obviously is set up to be in that show at some point. I don't know if you're aware of that casting news.
Nope.
She is due to be in that show.
I would have been surprised if they hadn't taken the opportunity. So it makes sense they've cast her.
I mean, what I really like about the credits, the end credits, is the credits are the same each time, but they don't include the names of people who haven't appeared in the episode. So, spoiler, for the second episode, obviously Zemo appears at the end, and his slide in the end titles is therefore filled in. It actually has his name, the actor's name, Daniel Bruhl, against it. In fact, there's a picture of Sharon Carter about 3 slides into the end credits that doesn't have a name against it. I thought that would have been quite an obvious clue that she was going to appear at some point.
Look, right, now, you've got to bear in mind here that I'm not very clever.
Yeah, space physicist is not very clever.
I mean, right, but what I don't do is look at credit sequences, Ian. I look at spaceships. They're different. Now, if it was a solar flare, I could have told you about that, but it wasn't.
If Sharon Carter had appeared in a solar flare,
yes,
that would probably be newsworthy.
That would be weird. Yeah. No, so moving on to Black Widow, from the kind of Agent 13 perspective, her and Steve spend a lot of this movie flirting.
Yeah.
But she is wearing an arrow necklace the whole way through, which I assume is meant to make us think that she is into Hawkeye. But having seen Age of Ultron, we know that Hawkeye is happily married with 2 kids who call Black Widow Aunt Nat. So
yeah, so it could just been a arrow necklace.
But I mean, yeah. Would you say that they were entirely aware of what they were doing with the Black Widow, Hawkeye, and Black Widow Cap relationships through the first few movies of the MCU?
Maybe. I don't know. It's a difficult one because Black Widow and Hawkeye obviously had a relationship early in the comic books, I believe. She sort of seduced him and used him to attack the Avengers, and he had a heel turn and joined the Avengers. That's sort of how they came to be, I believe. Maybe they were just playing into that. They certainly, in the Avengers, the first one, played into the fact that they were friends and clearly, good friends. I mean, a lot of people talked about when this came out, they said, oh, well, what about the relationship between her and Hawkeye? And I never got the impression from the first Avengers that they were anything more than comrades and friends. Yeah, I've got to say the necklace is something that has eluded me. I didn't actually, maybe I did notice it, but I didn't think twice about it, to be honest.
Watching it today, I think is like the 4th or 5th time I've seen it, and I think I only noticed it today. But it just stuck out to me a little bit in the scene where they're cleaning up after they've gone to Sam's place to lie low. She's wearing it then, and it just kind of stuck in my mind as like it's an odd choice, because I agree with you that I don't think her and Hawkeye are set up romantically in that first Avengers movie. I think the vibe I get from them is friendship too. I don't know. It's clearly they're on purpose, and I don't know. Maybe it is just supposed to evoke their friendship. I don't know.
But I don't think either of those characters, Clint or Natasha, are the kind... First of all, I don't think Natasha's the kind to go and buy a arrow necklace to show her love for Clint. And I don't think Clint's the kind of person who's going to give her an arrow as a necklace to wear.
I think you might be giving Clint too much credit here, Ian.
You think he's just so into arrows?
He bloody loves arrows. Like, if we know one thing about the man...
It is pretty much the only thing we know. He likes arrows and mustard on hot dogs.
And farms. Or ranches.
I suppose. He didn't seem that keen about the farm. Any excuse to get out of there.
Yep. But in general, I really like Black Widow in this movie. And I really like how she almost acts as the character which morphs it from a superhero movie to a spy movie. Because the part where they're running through... Or not running. part where they're walking through the shopping centre and he's like outlining the plan, like, here is how I'm going to beat all these people up and we're going to run away. And she's like, or we could just hug. And he's like, what? And she's like, no, for reals. And that's the point where you sort of go from Cap's world of, I will attack every problem by throwing my shield at it, or my fist, or both, to her world of, well, there are alternative paths through this. And I really like that whole kind of shopping centre scene. I think it does quite a good job of setting up their relationship in the movie. Yeah. And I do like her in it. She's a good character.
I agree. Yeah, I think she is, she's enjoyable as a character throughout the series, really. And yeah, that does a really nice job of establishing their friendship. There's a bit of flirting, but as we've already said, Cap flirts with everyone throughout this film. So that's, neither here nor there, really. As we have mentioned on this podcast before, I believe in our Valentine's Day episode, the relationship between her and Banner in Age of Ultron is one that we never quite got behind. I don't think a lot of people did, but I might be wrong about that. I mean, what were your thoughts on that?
I really liked that, but I think I would have liked it more if it had come from somewhere and gone somewhere. I think maybe having a little bit of foreshadowing in a previous movie and then maybe, following it up in a subsequent movie would have been good, but they didn't.
Yeah, because they had a bit of dynamic between them in the first Avengers, but it was mostly her running away scared and being the only person that could bring him in. And then in the last Endgame movie, obviously, everything that happens in that, he expresses obviously rage about that, but without going into too many spoilers. But yeah, it's something that she basically has one scene where she tells him why she might be romantically interested in him, and nothing is done with it before or since.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a strange one because that happens several times with various characters throughout the MCU, is that characters will all of a sudden be in a sort of romantic entanglement with someone out of the blue, but more often than not there is at least some setup and at least some conclusion to that has a payoff.
So what you're saying is that we're going to see a Black Widow Hulk TV show?
We will at some point see a Black Widow film, I'm sure. It's meant to be coming to Disney Plus now, but probably not much payoff.
Yeah, fair enough.
I assume. I might be completely wrong, but they've not really billed it as the rom-com that we're expecting.
No. One last thing on this movie, which isn't to do with the characters.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed there's an awful lot of people jumping out of planes and buildings without parachutes. And that is something that Falcon and the Winter Soldier continues. The Captain America-ness of just jumping out of a plane without a parachute is established very early.
Yeah.
And then they really do kind of lean into that motif in a way that I thought was most pleasing. Everyone gets to jump out of a building. It's a jamboree. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, why wouldn't you? If they're not jumping out buildings without parachutes, they're running.
Yeah.
Possibly running towards the edge of a building.
Exactly. This is basically the long jump movie of the MCU.
Right, well, on that note, shall we move on to the comic books and discuss those a little? I think that's everything you need to know, actually, about the film. I think it's running and jumping, the movie. Let's go on to the comic.
Running, jumping, and some characters. And it's a good time.
It is a good time. But we'll sum up our thoughts in the conclusion. So what about the comic book? What were your thoughts on that?
All right, so I'm going to get this out of the way first. And I'm going to reveal a secret about you, Ian, to the listeners, which is that Ian is a nerd.
It's true.
And I am also a nerd. And we both play a card game called Marvel Champions. And we both, I believe, own the Captain America Hero Pack for Marvel Champions. And the problem I have with Captain America in the comics and in that Hero Pack is that he is depicted as the squarest jawed dude in the history of dudes. And the way he's drawn makes him look such like a kind of stereotypical soldier guy that I always just have this instinctive reaction of, he looks like a dick. And that's unfair. But it means I go into all of his comics with this expectation that he's going to be the stereotypical soldier guy.
Yeah.
And I think casting Chris Evans, who is obviously very, very buff, but doesn't quite have that kind of square-jawed military look to him, he's got a nice smile. But the character as drawn in the comics looks like the military man, the O'Neill from the Stargate movie. It looks like that.
Okay.
It's very specific.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I noticed reading through is when he's talking to Sharon, I'm like, he looks like a dick. And that's unfair. It's an unfair thing to bring to the story. It's entirely on me, and I did get over it. But that was my first overriding impression, was this guy needs 20% less jaw.
Were you intimidated by his jaw? Was that it?
It's just, I looked at his jaw and I was like, I'm never going to have a jaw like that. And no one should.
I mean, it is true, though, because the general consensus before the films came out and before this comic book run is that Cap was a bit square.
Yeah.
He was a little bit of the Boy Scout. The same opinion that people have of Superman, who don't really know anything about Superman, is that he is just a pure Boy Scout and is not interesting because he does good things all the time and isn't killing people. And I think that's why when they got Ed Brubaker, who is probably best known for his sort of pulp crime works he's done, Criminal and things like that with Sean Phillips. He's also written for Vertigo and DC at various times. But yeah, they got him as a writer and gave him Cap. And I think it really works well to play against those Boy Scout aspects of Cap's personality. This idea that he is pure, good guy superhero who in the comics is only at peak physical human fitness. He's not even a superhero. In the films, they much more overtly give him super strength. Whereas in the comics, his power is he is the peak physical human specimen. And so, yeah, I think giving it to a writer like Ed Brubaker gives it this sense of gritty, down-to-earth style. I think that's what sort of recontextualized him going forward. And it had a huge knock-on on the character going forward from then, and that's why it's so influential on the films that we see. A lot of them, even though this is a relatively recent run, are based on Ed Brubaker's take on the character.
I didn't know what to expect from the character because I hadn't read any Cap before I saw the movies, unless you count the first trade paperback of Ultimates.
Right.
By Mark Miller?
Yes, it is by Mark Miller. So, yeah, because this comes up later in my notes, there is a speech that Steve gives in this comic book. I think it's issue 5 or 6, where he talks about France in World War II. And he speaks quite encouragingly about the French soldiers. Yeah. And he says, they never gave up. And this is why it annoys him that people always make jokes about France surrendering. Now, there is a line in the Ultimates where Captain America shouts, "Surrender! Do you think this letter on my head stands for France?" And then he decapitates someone with his shield. And that came out a couple of years before this comic book. And I honestly think that this is a direct rebuttal to that scene. Because the Ultimates universe was sort of...
It was edgy.
It was edgy. It was basically Marvel when, what if we reinvent all of your favourite comic book characters, but as enormous douchebags?
Yep. Except for Spider-Man. I quite liked Ultimate Spider-Man.
Spider-Man was good. And Miles Morales was good. There was some good stuff to come out of the Ultimate Universe, but not anything to do with the Ultimates, where every single character was ramped up to 11 and all of their negative traits were just exasperating.
I'm glad you mentioned the Ultimates, because my other big problem with the characters in this comic was Nick Fury is a white guy. And I know on an intellectual level that Nick Fury was white in the comics before they cast Samuel L. Jackson and before they effectively cast Samuel L. Jackson in the Ultimates comics, because in that first Ultimates comic he says like, oh, if there was a movie of me, I'd be played by Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah.
But I did know, David Hasselhoff played Nick Fury, making him, I think, the only cinematic character to have been played by the Hoff and SLJ, which is some kind of huge...
We'll look into it and see if there's another overlap. Maybe the Hoff played Shaft at some point.
Yeah. In early drafts of the prequel trilogy, they actually cast the Hoff as Mace Windu. No one can know that. And so I was reading, I was like, I know intellectually that Nick Fury is white, but it is so jarring that he isn't black. I was like, I know, and I'm going to just cope, and it's going to be fine. But it is weird. It is so weird. Because he's in so many of the Marvel films. I know him so well, but I know him as a black guy. And so, yeah, it was a bit of an odd one.
Because they later went as far as to introduce Nick Fury Jr. in the mainstream Marvel universe and then almost kill off Nick Fury without really killing him off. He got sequestered on the moon, where he's stuck now. And then having a villain cut out Nick Fury Jr.'s eye so that he looks more like Nick Fury.
So I love everything about that. But what I particularly love is that they have chosen the whitest place in the solar system to send the white Nick Fury. That is some metaphor. That is art right there. You can't buy that kind of metaphor. Unless you buy it from your local newsagent.
I think he now lives with the Watcher, which is ironic for a man with one eye, on the blue area of the moon.
On the blue area of the moon. They've ruined the metaphor. Never mind that comic. But yeah, so what you were saying about the recontextualization of Cap. So the comic does several things in that vein. I really liked that speech about France. It's something I've always quite powerfully felt is kind of, it's very easy to make judgments about people when their countries are invaded and their way of life is taken away. And I hope that never happens to me. And I really like Cap's take on it. But there's other things, and I was reading on Marvel Unlimited, so unlike reading in a trade paperback, I was also reading the letter pages. And one of the recurring points being made in the letter pages were people saying like, oh, like when you announced Brubaker would be doing this, I was like, but that's the guy from Batman. Why would you have him for Cap? That doesn't make sense. And then I really like the new take on the character. So I was kind of aware of that context from what people were writing at the time. But the other thing that really makes it so clear that this is not going to be a kind of 4-color superhero comic book is, well, there are two things. Firstly, the end of that first issue where you've been reading the Red Skull and he's plotting and he's talking about the cube and he's like, I'm going to do awful things and Captain America's going to be really sad. And then at the end of that first issue, he's shot. And that is just mind-blowing. I was not expecting that. I was like blown away. So this is such a powerful statement of intent as to what the author is doing with the comic. And it really makes that scene where the Red Skull is just monologuing and Alex is like, I want the cube, and the Red Skull's like, I would never give you the cube, I will crush you instead. And I'm like, well, but then you've just made an enemy, Red Skull. Like, try being nice about it, or at least subtle. And I was glad that backfired. But the other thing is when Nick Fury suspects that Cap might have killed him. And that's almost the reverse of the comic, where instead of Cap not trusting Fury, it's Fury not trusting Cap. There's something weird happening in Cap's head through the novel, and it means that both Sharon Carter and Nick Fury have reasons to kind of doubt Steve. And that, I thought, was also a really powerful kind of thing to set up in the reader's mind, like this sense of doubt as to, firstly, whether or not the main character is telling you a narrative that's actually what happened, because he's not sure. But secondly, having key characters that you know distrust the main character is quite interesting.
Yeah, because it's coming off the back of an event called Avengers Disassembled. I think it's mentioned a couple of times throughout the comic book. And basically the Avengers broke up after several members, including Hawkeye, died, and Hawkeye was very much Cap's protege and follow-up leader in the comic books. And as such, at the beginning of this story, Cap isn't in a very good place. And I think that's what's influencing a lot of people's views on him. They think he may have just snapped because of that. And what you're saying about the Red Skull is really interesting as well, because one of the other mission statements of this was to introduce new villains rather than just rehashing Red Skull over and over and over again. In fact, we get, I think, again at the beginning of this comics, it's mentioned that the Red Skull is currently inhabiting a cloned body of Steve Rogers. And that's just something to say for the clusterfuck that is the Avengers storyline and Captain America's storyline, and how many times he comes up against Red Skull and they have a reason to bring him back again. It happens again in this comic, but they sideline him straight from the first issue and they introduce new characters, and they will continue to introduce new villains throughout Ed Brubaker's run. Part of the intent was to get rid of Red Skull so that they could focus more on Captain America and other villains.
Yeah, no, and I think it works. I thought it was very well done. I have two questions for you, though, about the comic, as a comics expert, which is, firstly, in the comics, I got the impression from this comic that the Cosmic Cube was like a man-made object, but obviously in the films, it's an Infinity Stone. So how does that intersect?
It isn't an Infinity Stone in the comic books. It's pretty much it. It is an item that has turned up at various points. People have tried to create them. In this story, I believe they said it's made by AIM, this particular one. But there have been several, and they have been broken, and they have been reforged, and they have been... And they're sort of, unlike the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where it is just a powerful item that does things. They're sort of like, this is a hugely powerful item, it will almost certainly backfire on the user, so kind of like a monkey's paw situation. But they are not that sort of absolute one-of-a-kind thing that we have in the films. It is something that has cropped up over and over and over again, and has come back in various stories, and at any point someone could turn around and say, yes, I have rebuilt the Cosmic Cube, and everyone will go, oh, not again, rather than being massively surprised by it.
Yeah, that's fair. That is the impression I got. It just surprised me that it was not the same in the movies, because I had not appreciated that.
Because they call it the Tesseract in the films as opposed to the Cosmic Cube, which is obviously a very different title.
And then the other thing was, so we read issues 1 to 14 of Brubaker's run, and there is the House of M issue in the middle.
There is,
and that was weird.
Yeah, issue 10.
Because I've read crossover issues in modern Marvel, and I would say they were slightly more subtle than this one was. So yeah, that was a bit of a weird detour into a parallel universe, and I read it and I was like, cool.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, have you read House of M?
I have not read House of M.
So
no.
that will explain.
I'm familiar with it because of WandaVision, obviously, like people have been talking about it, but I've never read it.
Yeah, so basically it would have been difficult to do this in a more subtle way, because the point of House of M is Wanda rewrites the entirety of reality to create a world where the House of M, Magneto, are like the royal family who are in charge of everything, and mutants are the superior race. And as such, it hugely affects all of history. So you couldn't really have done that story and just had Cap being Cap in it, and something going on in the background, as you could with various characters during Civil War and things like that. Yeah, I mean, it's largely irrelevant to what goes on around it in the rest of these 14 issues, but I think it's an interesting take on what would have happened to Cap if he hadn't gone into the ice.
He'd have gone to see Nick Fury on the moon. It was interesting, and I think obviously because the whole run is about you keep having flashbacks to Bucky, having the alternate history of what would have happened. It was interesting, and it was well tied in.
Yeah,
it was just kind of a hard left turn for an issue, which was interesting.
This is unfortunately and we talked about crossovers is what got you into comic books, really. You started reading one and it spiraled from there. But unfortunately, this is the flip side of that, is it can hugely derail a run that you're enjoying. You're going through it. Oh, great! Here's Captain America. I'm in the middle. I think it's right in the middle, like 2 issues into the Winter Soldier arc, and then it has this one-off issue about Cap in an alternate dimension, and then it goes back to the normal storyline, and it really feels like there's no intention and no attempt to tie that into what was going on around it. It was just, here's the story, here's the tie-in issue you requested, publish it now and let me get on with the rest of my story.
Yeah.
I don't believe there's any real intent apart from that. I think he had already written his other story. Here's your one-off issue, publish it whenever you want. It won't be linked to anything and mentioned again. But on the flip side to that, there is another one-off issue in the middle of all of these, issue 7, The Lonesome Death of Jack Monroe.
Yes. I liked it a lot. It really plays with the unreliable narrator thing a lot more than the rest of the run does. I can see that it's exploring effectively the same themes as the wider story, but because it's a character that I think has already been killed at the point you read the issue.
Yes, he does. He gets killed somewhere in the first 6 issues. And then in issue 7, we learn what happens to the last year of his life. Because he is a character who had been around for a while. He was the 3rd Bucky, I want to say. He was Nomad. He was Nomad for a while, and then he was the Scourge. He had been all these other characters, but had been largely unloved for a little while. And so to kill him off out of nowhere and not give him a little context, ordinarily I'm not down for that sort of thing. I don't like it. I think every character is going to be someone's favourite character. But I do feel like the issue 7 gave it some context, even if it isn't particularly glamorous way to go out still.
Yeah, it almost reads more Vertigo than DC in a way. And also, like, you say that we know what he's been doing the last year of his life, but I'm not sure we do. I think the whole issue might take place when he's outside the diner.
Yeah.
Because the thing he says that he overhears that sets him on the path of trying to kill all of the drug dealers, that sentence is something on the last page of the issue. You find out that sentence is being said as he's outside with the Winter Soldier. And so I wonder whether the whole thing is like a hallucination thrown up by his brain in the last moments of his life.
See, my impression was that he had overheard him saying that line in the pub earlier, just someone having the same conversation. And then he had gone on his little rampage. And that's why we keep seeing these images of him beating up what he assumes is a drug dealer. We then cut back to reality and we see it's just a couple of businessmen. And we see that several times throughout the issue. And then the big reveal, obviously, after he dies, is that the man who is supposedly selling drugs to children is actually an ice cream man, which is a real tragic ending for the character. And this is, I think, where you get Ed Brubaker's noir roots really shining through. This feels completely noir, including the downbeat, tragic outcome.
100%. I really liked it. I thought it was very good. And I wasn't expecting there to be like a super gritty noir issue in the middle. Like I say, I thought it works really well and reinforces the core themes of the story really nicely.
Yeah. So we should probably, we'll wrap things up, but we should probably talk about Bucky, or the Winter Soldier, as he is the name of the film and the name of this arc of the comic book. So in the world of mainstream superhero comic books, where death is a little bit of a triviality.
Mm-hmm.
There was always a rule that Bucky and Uncle Ben, and to a lesser extent Gwen Stacy, should remain dead. Now, for a long time, Bucky did. I think it was established somewhere in the 60s that Bucky died around the same time as Captain America. Well, so everyone thought that Captain America died. And, you know, he went onto ice instead, and Bucky died at that point. And apart from the odd flashback, he did stay dead for 50 years. So it was a big deal when they brought him back. And it could have easily been poorly received. But instead, less than 10 years later, they're making films about it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically my question is, you know, how do you felt that the comic book dealt with the retconning of Bucky's death and, you know, Bucky as a character in general?
I think the film and the comic both deal with this really well, which is it's so easy, as you say, for comics to bring characters back, because I'm reading the modern Marvel universe and they've just brought Tony back from the dead. And like, he's having a few existential wobbles about it, but he'll be fine eventually and it'll all go back to normal. But I think the way they do this, it doesn't bring him back circumstance free. So you have a core part of who that character is going forward being tied up with the horrific circumstances that have allowed him to remain alive. And so in the film, it doesn't feel cheap because it's such a horrible thing, and you're not even sure whether he is going to ever become Bucky again because he is the Winter Soldier. Like, you don't know whether he's going to be able to be rehabilitated. I mean, you suspect he probably is, but it's not a sure thing. And the same's true in the comic. And I think, in general, I think the comic did a really good job. And this is another question I have for you, which is, when they did this, did people know that Bucky was coming back? Or was that a surprise when that issue came out that it was Bucky?
I don't think it was a surprise when it came out. I think it had been rumoured and it had been sort of advertised slightly that he was coming back. So there were murmurings. But yeah, I mean, I think it was quite a surprise when they announced that. So yeah. Captain America and Bucky was always more of this sort of, you know, boy wonder to his Batman. He was a sort of squeaky clean, you know, the boy sidekick that doesn't actually make sense. Why would you have a child go to war with you? And I think what I like about this comic book is it actually gives Bucky a bit more grit to him and a reason for why you would have they age him up a bit. And I think that's what this comic book does well, is retconning Bucky to have more of an impact in Steve's early days than just being the boy sidekick.
No, and that's one of the things I noticed was that in the movie they were able to pitch this as Bucky and Steve being childhood friends. Yeah. Obviously in the comic you don't have that. And I think I am badly placed to kind of discuss the extent to which they did it well, almost because I don't have any of the history. I live in a world where Bucky coming back seems like a completely normal and sane thing to happen. But I don't know how I would have reacted. I don't know how I would react if they brought Uncle Ben back tomorrow, for instance.
Yeah, so it is that sort of thing. It's if they brought back Uncle Ben and they made him an assassin and all of this weird backstory that they changed.
Now you're saying it, I'm 100% on board. Like, I've just realised this is excellent. They need to do it.
Yeah. With great firepower comes great responsibility. So it's a bold move, and I think it could have easily gone wrong. But I think they did a good job with it as well. I completely agree.
So the only bum note, I think, of the Bucky story is the way the Cosmic Cube is deployed at the end.
Yeah.
And I haven't read past issue 14, and I might do because I was enjoying it, so I might carry on. But in the movies, I think one of the really nice things is that the redemption doesn't feel unearned. You see the character struggling. You see in Civil War how much he doesn't want to be brought back under the code words. And then Falcon and the Winter Soldier now, and like, there's no part of me that's like, oh, is Bucky undeserving of this? Like, we're seeing his trauma and things like that. And I'm not sure whether I would have felt the movies did as good a job with that if they had said, oh, we use an Infinity Stone and like we address a lot of these issues. Yeah. And in the comic they used the Cosmic Cube. And it might be that like the monkey paw kind of nature of the Cosmic Cube means that it has ramifications which are then explored through the rest of the run. So I might be off base here. But it did instantaneously, it felt a little bit cheap. I was a bit like, oh, that seems like a bit of a get out. in that kind of way.
I know what you mean, especially now we've seen it adapted for the films and not having that Deus Ex Machina. It works a lot better, I think, in that. I would say going forward, it isn't as quick and cut and dry as he's better now. Great. There is a more development to that. Really, where we leave off with this comic is only where we've left off with the film, is that he and Steve have just had a massive fight, and we are getting glimpses that Bucky is remembering in the film by him going back to the Smithsonian, and seeing himself in the comic by him going back to the army base where he and Steve met. So we really leave off at the same point without that further context, which you already have from the MCU but you don't have from the comic books. I don't think you've got quite the full story, but I agree with you that I like the idea of him remembering slowly and naturally because of something Steve says, as opposed to being a magical or external fix.
So you mentioned the part where he goes to the Smithsonian. Is that in this film?
That's the after credit scene, not the mid credit scene, the after credit scene.
Right, okay, I think we might have switched it off before then. Because I remember the scene and I was like, it must have been the after credit scene in a different Marvel movie. Because Disney Plus did the thing where the screen went small and I was like, oh, there must not be another after credit scene. Foolish, I should know better.
That happened to us as well, and I almost turned it off as well, but I went, I swear there's an after credit scene where he goes to the Smithsonian.
I thought there was, but well, I should have trusted my instincts. The other thing about the comic is that Falcon can talk to birds.
He can.
Yeah.
He actually has a power in the comic books, as opposed to in the film where he is man in suit. He has a power to talk to birds. And he has Redwing, who is an actual bird who follows him around.
Yeah. And I just want to know, Ian, why didn't they put that in the movies?
They hate art in the movies. I honestly don't know. I think they could. I mean, let's face it, it's not the most abstract thing that would have happened in these films. I suppose within the context of this film, it may have been a bit too much explanation for them to explain why this man could talk to birds. I'm not sure I could explain it now, and I at one point knew, but just take it as read. He can talk to birds. They are his eyes and ears while he's in the sky, and his best friends.
Yeah, he's the Aquaman of birds.
Yeah, I suppose so. Less useful, perhaps, because he can't control whales and which I never quite understood. I suppose Aquaman was sea life that he could control or talk to, but why could he talk to whales and not other mammals?
Well, okay, so can Falcon talk to bats in Marvel?
No, it's birds.
Okay, so that's interesting.
And it's not like I can only speak to flying birds because I can fly. I'm assuming he can speak to chickens and things as well.
That must be, he must not be able to eat eggs for breakfast then.
Maybe he doesn't, I don't know.
All right.
Or maybe he's okay with it. I mean, I think some birds eat eggs. They're fine with it.
But anyway.
Birds eat other birds, don't they? They're cannibals.
So what we've discovered is that there are potential moral ramifications for Falcon's power in the comics that there might not be in the movies. No, so more seriously, I do understand why they didn't give him the power of talking to birds in the movies, because I do think...
Yeah.
I wasn't sure whether we would see him in this comic, so I was kind of glad when he does turn up. And, I thought it was good. And he's black.
He is.
And I was like, aha, this is not as jarring as it was for Nick Fury.
It was quite a white comic up until that point as well, though, wasn't it? I think it's only about 12 issues in that he turns up.
Yeah.
And now I mention it, I can't think of a single black character until that point.
I don't think there is one. I mean, it was a different time. It was 15 to 20 years ago.
2005?
Yeah. No, I mean...
Let's not dwell on that. Let's dwell on something else instead. So we did have something missing from last episode, and it's something that people are outraged by. I have received many fan letter to say that they are missing Ian's egg hunt. Now, I can't do it. It wouldn't make any sense. I have no idea what an Easter egg is or how to find them. So I have instead conscripted John here to take over. So cue the music. John's egg hunt.
I'm not joking, yeah? Alright, so the first Easter egg is, at one point, there's a Quinjet, and Quinjets have been in other Marvel films. No, so there's a film, there's a Quinjet that takes off at one point, and it has the number 42 on the side. And people who are fans of Douglas Adams may know that 42 is the answer to everything in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I know I was like, that's a 42. Good reference.
It is indeed, yeah. Again, I will throw in, is there anything surrounding that? Is that a reference, or is it just happened to be they had to put a number on the ship and they put 42?
Mate, it's definitely an Easter egg. What are you on about?
Well, it's in the Easter egg segment, so I suppose it's got to be.
What do you take me for? Other Easter egg is at the end of the movie when they're attending Nick Fury's grave, there is a Bible verse on the headstone which is attributed to Ezekiel, and that's a reference to Sam Jackson's work in the film Pulp Fiction, in which he quotes an Ezekiel verse towards the beginning of the movie.
The path of the righteous man.
Yes, exactly.
Beset on all sides. Yeah, I don't actually think... I seem to remember reading that it's not a real Bible quote, and Quentin Tarantino took it from a kung fu movie or something, and then just had the character say it's from Ezekiel. And then everyone since has gone, yeah, it's my favourite Bible verse.
Yeah, so I know it's not in the Bible. I don't know if it's in a kung fu movie or not, but I know it is not a real Bible verse. But then I think that suits Samuel L. Jackson to have his own version of the Bible that has much more quotable verses in it.
Yeah, and a lot more swearing, presumably.
Yes. Oh, and that's actually... There's a point in the comic where Nick Fury, he uses like a super tame swear word. And I was like, that's another thing. When you've got a character played by Samuel L. Jackson and they use... I think it might be even the word flippin'. And I'm like, there is no version of Nick Fury in my head that uses the word flippin' as a swear word.
The thing is... Nick Fury in the comic books is actually born in the late 1900s. So he is probably going to be using words like flippin' and I imagine a lot of 1930s slang. Whereas new Nick Fury, oh, it's motherfucker this and all that, you know.
Yep. I did also notice on the subject of the ethnicities of the movie, the only swear word in the comic is said by the black man. So that's good.
Is that an Easter egg?
I don't think it's an Easter egg. It's a comment on ethnic diversity.
Perhaps that's a new segment for next episode.
Ian gets back and you're like, yeah, we've replaced the Easter eggs with commentaries on ethnic diversity. And he's like, but another Easter egg. It's not really an Easter egg because it's a Stan Lee cameo and they're in all of them. But I do like the Stan Lee cameo in this one where he's in the Smithsonian and worried he might get fired. It's not my favourite Stan Lee cameo, but it's pretty good.
What's your favourite Stan Lee cameo?
I think it is the one from Spider-Man Homecoming. Is it Homecoming? He's listening to the music on the headphones and the lizard and Spider-Man are having the fight in the background.
That so must be Amazing Spider-Man 1.
Yes. Yeah, I do like that cameo. It's a good one.
I like his one where he's telling the story to the Watcher on the Moon. I think it's Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Isn't my favourite MCU film, but I like the idea that Stan Lee is the storyteller telling everyone the stories of the MCU anyway. It's a nice letter.
Yeah, it is. It's good. The other one is Captain Marvel, where he's reading the script for Mallrats on the train.
Yes.
That is
one of the few where he plays himself.
Yep.
I think we've deviated away from Easter eggs.
Yep.
Shall we get back on topic and wrap things up with a conclusion? What were your overall opinions of the film and the comic book?
I liked them. I think the film is one of the stronger films in the MCU. So I think the film has stood up as well. I don't think it feels worse now than it did then. I think it is still very good. Whereas some MCU movies from the early MCU, I think you rewatch them now and you're like, oh no, I mean, I can see why I loved this, but there are parts that haven't aged as well.
Yeah.
I think especially because it has a lot of action in it, but all of the action furthers the plot and doesn't feel tedious or just there for the sake of having some explosions. And it really ticks along at a good pace. And I really like the comic. I thought the comic was really, really good. Obviously, there are aspects of the characterizations which I found a little bit jarring, having not read any Cap in the comics previously. But in general, I really enjoyed it. And as I say, I might carry on reading. I might even start reading Cap in the modern MCU to see if that's any good.
Yeah, no, I think you should. And there's also the run of the comic books where Falcon took over the role of Captain America, and also prior to that where Bucky took over the role of Captain America. So there's been various people to wield the shield at various points. But yeah, I would certainly, if you enjoyed this, carry on reading the rest of this run. I think there's only about 50 issues and it ties pretty nicely into what comes afterwards. So you may even want to read a bit more. But I mean, in general, which did you prefer?
I think I prefer the movie. I think the comic book has a few aspects that I found a little bit jarring, particularly the House of M crossover. But also, like, I don't think the main baddie, the general, I don't think he's as compelling as Alexander Pierce in the movie. And that's not a criticism of the comic necessarily. I just think the movie does... I think the movie does a phenomenal job with its villain. And I think the comic does a great job with its villain. But as a result, I think the movie slightly edges it. Although I do love that the comic kills Red Skull, so maybe they're actually more even than I think. But I think also, like, I imagine that with any comic character, you have something a bit like your version of Doctor Who, where, like, the one you know is the one you feel most comfortable with. And I think for me, Captain America is Chris Evans, so that's the other thing. I think I can see how the Cap in the movies comes from this comic. But for me, the characterization is just slightly different in a way that I don't love. But again, that's a very nitpicky point. I enjoyed both very much.
So would you recommend them to people?
I'd recommend the movie, obviously, although I probably don't start with this movie.
No. You might be a bit confused.
Yes. I think I would recommend the comic to people, especially if they want to know kind of more about where the MCU has come from, because this is clearly such a pivotal comic in creating the modern MCU. I mean, arguably without this, Falcon and Winter Soldier wouldn't be airing on Disney+. So this is a comic which has clearly informed an awful lot of the MCU world building.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in seeing how that happened, I think this is a good one to watch.
And if someone was going to watch the film and read the comic book, what order would you say to do it in?
I mean, I assume that everyone I know who would be likely to read the comic has already seen the movie. So I'd probably say watching the movie first makes sense. But they're different enough that I don't think one spoils the other. It's not like Persepolis, where I'm really glad I read the book before seeing the movie, because I think knowing the punchlines to some of the jokes without the setups would have spoiled the jokes in the book.
Yeah.
I think this book has some of the same character beats, but I think it's different enough that I don't think there's a right way to do it. I think you could probably start with either and still have a good time.
Yeah, I agree. I think they've done a good job at paying homage to the comic book without telling that exact same story. It definitely, the film feels like its own thing. I mean, the comic works with sort of years of continuity and things that have come before it, introducing these characters. They don't really have to set up the Falcon and Sharon Carter and all of this. They can just throw them in there and use them to the heart's content. I also think there's not really, in those first 14 issues of the comic book that we've read anyway, not really enough of a plot to justify a film. I think there's no world-ending event. There's nothing particularly threatening. It is really only a personal battle between him and his ex-partner. So I think that they've done a really good job making the film its own thing and adding extra threat to it. And as I say, I completely agree. I really like Alexander Pierce's villain.
And that actually, something we haven't mentioned, is that the comic doesn't have Hydra in it.
Doesn't.
Like, at all, which is a huge part of the movie. I think makes a lot of sense for the movie. Because I think in the book, the thing I was saying about Winter Soldier almost being the anti-Cap is much less true, because he's not Hydra. And so I wonder whether the film latches onto that in a way and builds on it by introducing Hydra element.
Yeah, because he's a weapon for, first of all, a Soviet villain and then a Russian villain. But he is very much, those are private interests. They're not representative of a country or an organisation.
And obviously, because this is the film that sets up Hydra's role in the MCU, this is the first movie where we see Hydra after we assume they are defeated in the first Avenger.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cool.
It's cool. Well, I think that's as good a summation as any. Have you got any other business?
I guess the only other thing is I'd forgotten the after credit scene that has Wanda and Pietro in it.
Oh, of course,
which felt, given that I've just got off the back of WandaVision, I was like, oh yeah, this is a good tie-in to watching Age of Ultron, which me and the wife might have to do at some point soon, just to kind of refresh our memories as to what was happening before WandaVision.
Yeah.
Because rewatching the movie, there were things we had forgotten, and I think we're going to enjoy the rest of Falcon and the Winter Soldier because we've rewatched the movie.
I think that's what they've done quite a good job with the MCU in general, is recontextualizing not only what's to come, but also what's come before with each new entry. So after watching WandaVision, it makes you want to go back and watch, as you say, Age of Ultron or Civil War, where those characters have interacted before, and giving a rewatchability because it's one extended story. It's something we've not really seen in cinema before. We've seen it in television and things like that, but I agree with that. I think it's nice to go back and rewatch things and pick up on things that they are alluding to that you thought at the time were relatively throwaway.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's it for us this episode. John, thank you again for filling in for Ian whilst he's been away. Have you enjoyed your time on Become the Teapot?
I have, and I am now a teapot.
Oh God. Are you okay?
Yeah, I just hope I don't fall off my chair or smash.
It's like a Beauty and the Beast situation.
Yes.
Okay, you'll have little cup children. Yeah?
Oh God, the horror.
So, one more time, where can our listeners find more from you if they want to?
I do a podcast called Octothorpe, where I talk about science fiction and science fiction fans. And I do another podcast called Watch This, where I play Arkham Horror the card game on my own.
And we'll throw some links up to those in the description. But thanks once again, and thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed Ed Brubaker's Captain America, then after reading the rest of Volume 5, which ran for 50 issues, plus a few one-offs here and there, you should check out his other Marvel works, such as a very solid run on Daredevil, and my personal favourite, his collaboration with Matt Fraction on The Immortal Iron Fist. You could also check out his works for the Distinguished Competition, like Gotham Central, or his crime noir works with Sean Phillips, such as Criminal and The Fade Out. As always, you can drop us an email on becometheteapot@hotmail.com or tweet us at becometheteapod. You can also find us on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe on your preferred listening platform. Now, I am hoping Ian is done moving and will be back in time for next episode, because it's time for him to take the reins as we watch something that I've never seen and know next to nothing about. Join us for our first foray into the world of CW/DC television as we check out a handful of episodes from Arrow Season 1 and read Green Arrow Year 1. God help me.
Is that coming up on my mic?
I can hear it, yes. I don't know what it is.
I'm podcasting here.